Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max. සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න. Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max. සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න.
හරිම සුළුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this Wednesday the 18th of January 2023. Barrier, China's main hurdle in Sri Lanka's pursuit of the IMF bailout package, says Julie Chung.
Sri Lanka does not have time to delay. They need these assurances immediately.
Chinese embassy in Colombo questions as to why the US didn't leverage its power within the IMF to provide more comfortable solutions to Sri Lanka. LG polls. The regulation of election expenditure bill to be debated in Parliament tomorrow. Enacted. The controversial draft bill of the Bureau of Rehabilitation passed in Parliament today with a majority of 17 votes. Condemned. SLPP MP Rear Admiral Dr. Sarath Veerasekara blames the Canadian government for sanctioning two former Sri Lankan presidents.
If there are no individual charges against the former two presidents, how can Canada government has found them guilty and impose sanctions?
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9 with Andrew Bernard. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Very good evening and welcome to AdaDerana 24's English News. In your top story for tonight, the second reading of the Bureau of Rehabilitation Bill taken up for debate in Parliament today was passed by a majority of 17 votes. The legislation in the making aims to set up a bureau known as the Bureau of Rehabilitation in order to rehabilitate misguided combatants and individuals engaged in extreme or destructive acts of sabotage and individuals who have become drug dependent.
In the recent history of this country, it has never been possible for the Supreme Court to say the entire bill violates the Constitution. Globally, including Sri Lanka, the approach towards compulsory rehabilitation is counterproductive when it comes to drug rehabilitation. Because it leads to relapse. You have these withdrawal symptoms of these drug-dependent persons. So it can lead to relapse and various other problems. So this has to be done through a proper medically qualified personnel who will run such centers. You don't involve the military in rehabilitation centers of this nature to rehabilitate. You don't compulsorily send people into rehabilitation centers. When you make it a compulsory rehabilitation, what happens in this Kandakadu and the Senapura centers? How many times have people broken away and run out? Because of torture that takes place there. Hard labor that they are subjected to. So this has to be regulated about drug-related issues and then overcrowding in prisons. Then this is not a solution for overcrowding in prisons. So if you are going to do that, then this bill has to go through radical changes, in my opinion. We feel that this bill must be reviewed once again. At least I plead with the government. Refer it to a standing committee and let us look at it before you put to vote.
This act has been taken before a consultative committee twice. For the first one, you've been there in the consultative committee and you all have requested for another time to give your opinion. So that meeting was also taken yesterday. But Honourable Member, you were not present.
Honourable Minister, your government has called for an election. We are party leaders. Busy
I totally understand. But
right?
what I want to clarify here...
You call for a consultative committee.
Deputy Speaker,
in the middle
what I want to clarify here...
concluded in 2-3 days. And we are filing nominations all over the country.
What I want to clarify here, Honourable Minister of Justice has given the opportunity for you all to submit your opinion, which you have not, you have failed. On the Supreme Court determination on page 17, B2, it clearly says the bill is limited to the rehabilitation of drug-dependent person and such other person as may be identified by law, not by an individual person, not by police or any other party. So this basically referred to the law. So I don't think there is any problem or any question arise here.
The same thing, the vagueness and lack of clarity in the core provisions, what the Supreme Court says. It says the answer that subsequent specific laws will deal with define the persons who require rehabilitation is a dangerous route for this court to adopt in the specific context of this case. It goes on to say it's the constitutional duty conferred by Article 123 in examining this bill on the basis that a future law will fill in all the blanks of this bill. Furthermore, in a constitutional framework that does not provide for post-enactment judicial review and only a limited time period for challenge of the bill, there is no guarantee that this court will definitely get the opportunity to consider the constitutionality of such subsequent bills. This is what we fear.
අපි මේ දරුවන්ගේ අනාගතය වෙනුවෙන් තමයි මේ නීති හදන්නේ. නැතුව මේක ආණ්ඩුවට විශේෂ වාසියක් ගන්න, ලාභයක් ගන්න කරන දෙයක් නෙවෙයි.
දැන් මේ පුනරුත්ථාපනය විශේෂයෙන්ම ඩ්‍රග් ඇඩික්ට්ස්ලානේ මේ විෂය ඇත්තටම සෞඛ්‍ය විෂයක්. ඉතින් ඉස්සලා මේක ඩිෆෙන්ස් එක යටතේ ජස්ටිස් එක යටතේ ඇයි තියන්නේ කියලා මම අහන්නේ.
මේ විෂය එකකට අපිට වෙන් කරන්න බෑ. මේක සෞඛ්‍ය ප්‍රශ්නයක්. මේක නීතිමය ප්‍රශ්නයක්. මේක ජාතික ආරක්ෂාව පිළිබඳව ප්‍රශ්නයක්. ඒක නිසා තමයි මේ පනත හදද්දී සියලුම අංශ සෞඛ්‍යාංශ මත්ද්‍රව්‍යනාශක අංශය හමුදාවල් පොලිසිය වෛද්‍යවරු මනෝචිකිත්සකවරු මේ සියලු දෙනාගේ දායකත්වය ඇතුව හැදුවේ මේක අපි තනියෙන් හදපු එකක් නෙවෙයි.
The Canadian government has imposed sanctions against two of our past presidents. They say the reason is the gross and systematic violations of human rights committed during the civil war between the Sri Lankan government and the LTT from 1983 to 2009. This is a typical example of how a sovereign government could be influenced by recent immigrants from Sri Lanka and separatist Tamil diaspora and the bloc vote of the Tamil community in Canada. So I unreservedly condemn this act of the Canadian government. It is a crass example of hypocrisy and double standard. If there are no individual charges against the former two presidents, how can Canada government has found them guilty and impose sanctions?
Now, it was decided during a special party leaders meeting chaired by President Ranil Wickremesinghe today that the regulation of the election expenditure bill should be taken up for debate in Parliament tomorrow. This comes despite the request made by the opposition yesterday to delay the bill being presented to Parliament by 1 month.
The Ministry of Justice Advisory Committee convened in order to discuss the final details before the regulation of election expenditure bill was passed. During this, the opposition MPs stated that the local government election could face issues if the new bill is passed in Parliament. As such, at the conclusion of the meeting, it was decided to delay the bill from being passed in Parliament by 1 month. However, Speaker Mahinda Abeyewardene announced today that President Ranil Wickremesinghe had called for an all-party meeting today to discuss the matter at 2:30 p.m. The Samika Jana Balawege, including its leader Sajith Premadasa, the Jatika Jana Balawege and Tamil National Alliance, did not participate in the meeting. Following this, all members representing the parliament took part in a special party leaders meeting held at 3 p.m. today. During this, it was decided to take the regulation of election expenditure bill up for debate tomorrow.
Now, the US Ambassador to Sri Lanka, Julie Chung, states that the main hurdle in Sri Lanka's pursuit of the $2.9 billion bailout package from the IMF is a delay by China to provide the country with necessary assistance pertaining to debt restructuring. These remarks were made by the ambassador while speaking to the BBC on the economic crisis in the island. Meanwhile, the governor of the central bank, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, also expressed his opinions on the delay in securing an agreement with the IMF.
When we thought we should be able to get the assurances within about 3 months, so that we were hoping to get the program unlocked from the IMF somewhere in December. For whatever reason that there was a delay, the sooner they give us financial assurances, that would be better for both, as a creditor, as a debtor. That will help for us to start repaying their obligations sooner than later.
Speaking on the present status of Sri Lanka's progress in securing an IMF agreement, US Ambassador to Sri Lanka Julie Chung pointed out the importance of China's role in the proceedings.
Beijing has said they are a friend of Sri Lanka, and I'm sure the Sri Lankan people would love to see that turn into action and make sure that there is not a delay and that Beijing really responds quickly without delay in terms of providing those financial assurances. Sri Lanka does not have time to delay. They need these assurances immediately. And we've seen, again, delays in Zambia and Chad and other countries where for one reason or another it's been held up. And China has been the spoiler. So again, for the sake of the Sri Lankan people, we certainly hope the PRC is not a spoiler as they proceed to attain this IMF agreement. We look for more coordination within the international community, not less, as we look towards how we can support countries in debt distress, help them get back on their feet, but in a way that the reforms will be long-lasting and not returning to the same cycle of debt distress that we've seen everywhere.
Now, following the remarks by the US envoy in Sri Lanka, the Chinese embassy in Colombo released a statement rejecting the claim that Chinese authorities are spoiling debt restructuring efforts in Sri Lanka. The embassy drew attention to the aid provided by China during the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, while also pointing out that the economic leverage the West has on Sri Lanka's external debt stock.
The Chinese embassy yesterday rejected the claim by Ambassador Julie Chung that China is causing an unaffordable delay in Sri Lanka's effort to secure an agreement with the IMF. In the statement, Chinese authorities pointed out that the US is eager to accuse China as a spoiler to the nation's negotiations with the IMF. The statement urged the US ambassador to consider the disproportionate power that the US has over major policy decisions due to its veto power. Highlighting US economic policies which impacted Sri Lanka during the economic crisis, the Chinese authorities also pointed out that the United States added $3 trillion to its money supply in 2020 alone. Furthermore, China also drew attention to the fact that 40% of Sri Lanka's external debt is owned by private creditors, predominantly in the West, who charge the highest interest rates. The statement also reminded that Sri Lanka was challenged with legal action in the federal courts of the United States immediately after the country's default. In the statement, the Chinese authorities highlighted the support that China gave Sri Lanka when the country faced its darkest hour. The embassy pointed out that China provided 10,000 metric tons of rice, 9,000 litres of diesel, medicine worth 5 billion rupees and 3 million fabric meters of school uniform materials as gifts as the country reeled from an acute foreign exchange crisis. The statement also mentioned that the public wonders about the preconditions of assistance provided by US aid while being assured of China's no-strings-attached commitment and practice. The embassy also raised the question as to why the US authorities didn't leverage their power within the IMF to provide Sri Lanka with a more comfortable solution, while questioning why grants weren't extended from the exorbitant amount of US dollars printed each year. The embassy stated that it was hypocritical of the US ambassador to play the blame game instead of self-examination.
Now, the Attorney General has informed the Colombo District Court that he would not appear on behalf of the former Chief of State Intelligence Service, Lanka Jayawardena, who has been named as a respondent of the petitions filed by the victims of the Easter Sunday attacks seeking compensation. He conveyed this to the court when the relevant petitions filed by the victims of the Easter Sunday attacks were taken up before the Colombo District Court earlier today. This development comes amid a recent order by the Supreme Court compelling the former Chief of State Intelligence Service to pay compensation to the tune of 75 million rupees to the victims of the Easter Sunday attack. Now, in the meantime, the Colombo District Court today fixed a date to announce a decision pertaining to whether or not President Ranil Wickremesinghe would be released from the 108 lawsuits filed against the criminal negligence of the duty in the Easter Sunday attacks of 2019. This announcement comes off the back of a Supreme Court decision made recently holding the former president, the former Secretary of Defense and key officers of the intelligence service liable to pay compensation to the victims of the Easter attacks.
Accordingly, the decision pertaining to the immunity of the president will be delivered on the 1st of March 2023. This decision was announced by Colombo Additional District Judge Mahesh Adi Silva when the 108 petitions filed by the victims of the Easter Sunday attacks seeking compensation were taken up in court earlier today. However, the head of state's legal counsel informed the court that as per Article 35 of the Sri Lankan Constitution, a case cannot be maintained against the president who is named as the respondent in these petitions and provided the court with written submissions in this regard. On the 12th of January, the Supreme Court found former President Maithripala Sirisena, former Defence Secretary Hemasiri Fernando, former IGP Pujit Jayasundara, former National Intelligence Chief Sisira Mendis and former Chief of State Intelligence Lanka Jayawardena in violation of the fundamental rights of the petitioners by failing to take action to prevent the Easter Sunday attacks despite receiving sufficient intelligence information.
Stay with us as we bring you more news regarding the developments of the Express Pearl vessel and the Purchasing Managers Index right after this short commercial break.
It's hard to keep up with the new when you're listening to the same old Slim Bread Week, a week for professionals.
Welcome back. Now, the former operators of the Express Pearl vessel responsible for one of the largest marine pollutions the world has seen so far, the Express feeders, confirmed today that the after-deck section of the vessel was removed from the ocean floor today. The salvage company announced that the on-site team has now diverted their focus on the remaining 4 sections of the vessel wreck and expect to remove that in the near future.
On the 20th of May 2021, the MV Express Pearl container carrier caught fire and ravaged Sri Lanka's pristine coastlines with the industrial and chemical debris on board in the weeks that followed. In the subsequent months, steps were taken by local authorities and the Shanghai Salvage Company to clean the shorelines affected and remove the debris that sat at the bottom of the ocean. Today, the former operators of the container ship Express Pearl, Express Feeders, announced that the aft section, also known as the afterdeck or the stern of the ship, has been successfully raised from the seafloor and is on board the semi-submersible Fanju 10. The wreck section will now be transported to a certified decommissioning facility for dismantling, recycling and disposal. The Shanghai Salvage Company's on-site team is now focusing on the remaining 4 sections of the wreck with the tandem lifting barges ZR122 and ZR123. The salvage company is planning to raise the last section in the near future depending on the prevailing weather conditions.
In business news, the Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index for December 2022 marked a contraction, recording an index value of 41.8, while the Services Managing Index showed growth and reaching an index value of 51.6, owing to an increase in tourism. These observations were pertaining to the economic performance of the manufacturing and services sector of the local economy in December of last year, were made by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka recently in a report.
According to data compiled by the Central Bank, the manufacturing PMI recorded an index value of 44.8 in December, indicating a continued setback in manufacturing activities. The decline in new orders and production was mainly driven by manufacturing of textile and wearing apparel sector. Subdued foreign demand due to seasonal holidays and economic slowdown experienced in major export destinations was the main reason for this decline. Manufacturers mentioned that although supply-side impediments such as high input cost and shortage of foreign exchange that affected importation of raw materials are yet to be resolved, demand slowdown due to deteriorated purchasing power of the customers was a key issue that restricted them from increasing production. Services PMI returned to growth territory, recording an index value of 51.6 in December 2022 after declining for 2 consecutive months. This increase was underpinned by the improvements observed in new business activities and expectations for activity subsectors. However, employment and backlogs of work continued to decline during the month. New businesses improved at a slower pace in December 2022 compared to November 2022, particularly with the increases observed in other personal activities, accommodation, food and beverages, and insurance subsectors. Business activities in the services sector continued its upward trend in December 2022. In line with the increase in tourist arrivals during the month, business activities related to other personal activities and accommodation, food and beverage subsectors showed significant improvements. Insurance, telecommunication and financial services subsectors also showed some increases compared to the previous month. Nevertheless, business activities related to the wholesale and retail trade subsectors deteriorated further during the month amid the continued cost of living challenges and shortages of certain items. Employment declined in December at a slower pace due to seasonal recruitments, though resignations, migrations and retirements continued during the month.
Now, the ASPI edged up as a result of price gains in counters such as Sampath Bank, Richard Pearce & Company and Valuable One, and stood at 8,386.27 with the turnover crossing 1.3 billion rupees. Meanwhile, the S&P SL20 edged down. High net worth and institutional investor participation remained subdued for the day. Mixed interest was observed in SoftLogic Capital, Capital Alliance and SoftLogic Life Insurance, whilst retail interest was noted in Brown's Investments, LOLC Finance and People's Leasing and Finance. Foreign participation in the meantime in the market activity remained at subdued levels, with foreigners closing as net buyers. Insurance sector was the top contributor to the market turnover, whilst the sector index lost 0.13%. The share price of SoftLogic Life Insurance moved up by 4.36% to close at ₹101.75. Diversified financial sector was the second highest contributor to the market turnover, as the sector index decreased by 0.28%. Now let's take a look at how the rupee traded against other major currencies in the world. In the meantime, oil prices today worldwide extended early gains to rise around 1% on optimism that lifting of China's strict COVID-19 curbs will lead to a recovery in fuel demand in the world's top oil importer. The market is also closely watching for more demand data from China in the International Agency's monthly report.
Brent crude futures climbed 0.88% to $86.68 a barrel by 7:21 a.m. GMT, following a 1.7% rally in the previous session. US West Texas Intermediate crude futures went up 1.06% to $81.03, having risen 0.4% yesterday. Both crude futures surged by more than $1 a barrel to hit fresh highs of 2023 around midday in Asia, with Brent reaching $87 a barrel and WTI futures hitting $81.42 a barrel. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries said in a monthly report that Chinese oil demand would grow by 510,000 barrels per day this year, after contracting for the first time in years in 2022 due to COVID containment measures. But OPEC kept its 2023 global demand growth forecast unchanged at 2.22 million barrels per day. Experts view that OPEC's optimistic outlook on China's demand also supported the market sentiment. The market was also supported by expectations of a drawdown in US crude stocks by around 1.8 million barrels despite higher oil product inventories. Meanwhile, a senior Russian source with knowledge of the nation's outlook said that Russia expects Western sanctions to have a significant impact on its oil product exports and its production, likely leaving it with more crude oil to sell.
Well, that's all the news we have for this evening. Join us again tomorrow for the very latest news at the very same time. Have a pleasant evening and good night.
For news and information you can trust 24 hours a day, visit AdaDerana.lk.